Welcome to Whatsoever More or Less. My name is Jason. I'm just a guy who's studied the Constitution a lot. I interpret it mainly through, I guess, what you'd call the Four Corners Rule, and the Four Corners Rule seems to be what our doctrine is. We say whatsoever more or less comes of evil. So almost seems to tell us, read the four corners. Jefferson and Madison seems to say the same thing, which is the tradition of the founders. And so if you ever look at my channel's icon, it has a picture of the Savior, in other words, the representatives of the Savior on earth, which would be prophets or the scriptures, and then the founding presidents, the five founding presidents of the United States. In particular, the main tradition that carried on from the founding days was Madison and Jefferson. Even though Washington and Adams were quite good men, they wanted a higher level of government, had a conflict with sticking strictly to the four corners, versus Madison and Jefferson seem to have stuck to it a little bit more. Where they are accused of violating it probably isn't near as much. But anyhow, sorry, I'm getting off the topic. The topic for today is harm and no harm. And I want to stay on the topic also of in harm's way. So my dad, for his career, his entire career, was law enforcement in one way or another. And so we call that somebody that puts themselves in harm's way to protect us from harm. This is the appropriate role generally of state governments to deal with the harmful side of things. So in other words, the things that revolve around the Ten Commandments, I think would be a fairly easy way to say it. So, and they should have very little to do with the federal government except for where citizens are being deprived of their privileges and immunities that they should have as they travel through all states. And so you've probably heard me say, some of you, that I think Van Buren got it incredibly wrong, that since the Constitution itself declares itself to be the supreme law of the land, it is a law, and the president has the take care clause to make sure the laws are faithfully executed. And so where the Saints were getting chased out of Missouri, he didn't need to wait for a petition from the governor to stop the domestic violence, because in that case, the domestic violence that was going on is recent immigrants to that state were being deprived of their privileges and immunities. So I do think he should have dealt with that. But in general, if you look at what the Constitution does, it creates for peaceful interactions between what would have been considered basically separate countries, separate states. The word states, as a general rule, means separate countries. But they're more closely united than, say, for example, ununited countries. They called it a more perfect union, right? And they reserved certain roles then to the federal government, very specific roles. And then the majority were left to the states and the people. Now, if we need to quickly determine what should be left to the people versus left to the states. Well, the smaller list is going to be what should be left to the states afterwards, honestly, which is going to be basically the Ten Commandments, if you ask me, and any kind of tangents to those. So, in the Ten Commandments, the first few deal with religion and morality, right, of a religious nature, observance of religion, and honoring of religion. This is appropriate. There's harm that can be done to a state when it's not a religious people. And so this is appropriate for a state to have a basic sense of protecting religion at the very least, right? Also, you could probably get into the religious standards regarding who marries who and everything like that. You could say no harm is being done when this kind of marriage is going on versus that kind of marriage. However, the long-term harm to society is actually a terrible one. So even the early commandments prevent harm in society. So when you read the First Amendment, for example, in the Bill of Rights, it's the only one that is specifically directed uniquely to the federal government. And all the other first Bill of Rights, so Amendments 2 through 9, by the way they're worded, apply to all levels of government. And John Marshall said no, they didn't, but he there were several dissenting opinions, and he got it wrong. He got it wrong. This is the problem with treating Supreme Court interpretation like it's the final meaning of the law. Everybody else knew he got it wrong, and they should not have treated it as though it was the binding meaning of the Constitution. So there were dissenters within his own court and within the different levels of government who disagreed with his stance, and I think they were the ones that got it right. Just the minority got it right, the majority got it wrong. Now let's look at the Ten Commandments. So we've got don't kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, and don't covet. I think two words that we probably misunderstand a lot: bearing false witness, that does harm. So we're not talking about simple lies. We are talking about something that actually imposes on your neighbor him being brought to justice for something he didn't do in the first place. By the way, I got a goat in labor, so that's why I'm sitting here today like this, just waiting to help her out as she needs it. So that's the false witness aspect. Let's not misunderstand that. Let's also look at the original interpretation of covet. I'm not an expert on it. I just did some basic research. My instincts told me that that's basically somebody wanting somebody else's stuff to the point that they plot to get it one way or another, either through some kind of careful legal means or some kind of careful manipulation of the law to their advantage, to take from another that which is theirs, right? So that's coveting. It's not just being like jealous or aspiring to one day have the same thing as your neighbor has, or saying, gee, I wish I had something just as nice as what my neighbor has. It's literally the early stages of planning some way of manipulating the law. This is why Jesus, for example, was annoyed, I believe, at the way the Pharisees justified the dodging of taking care of parents, because they're coveting their own property at this point. And this is a scriptural term. It's coveting your own property. I want to keep my own property. I don't want to do anything to, help out. So, but then you can't just stop at the Ten Commandments. You have to look at things that would cause the same results as violating the Ten Commandments. For example, my father-in-law, about 20 years ago or so, went and volunteered in Peru, where he had served his mission, along with my brother-in-law, to help with plumbing issues in the mountains. And what it was, these were the native tribes that had fled up there when the Spaniards were conquering it. And they hadn't lived like this prior to the Spaniards, but now they're suddenly living in this area, and they're putting their latrines a lot of times uphill, and then their water supply is downhill, and they're constantly making themselves sick. They're constantly like tainting the quality of their water. They're dying at a young age. So my father-in-law went and volunteered to help teach them how to set things up better, because he's an expert plumber, and so was my brother-in-law. But anyhow, that's called the Hope Project, by the way. I don't know if it still exists or not. But anyhow, if laws are made to prevent such things, even though you're not directly killing somebody when you do irresponsible plumbing practices where you put your sewage uphill from somebody's water supply, common cowboy sense would tell you that's wrong. Reckless driving laws and other laws that protect us from, cars are deadly if they're not, everybody knows that. I've been on the road a lot and I've seen a lot of car accidents. I know my dad's seen way more because of his job. To not protect the way people drive would be to recklessly not devalue life again. What else? Other kinds of water laws, like the creating of dams, things like that, the breaking of water, what do they call it? The water table and stuff. Anybody who's watched enough cowboy movies has seen these themes, where basically if you screw one thing up, you screw it up for everybody else around you and compromise their ability to survive. So that's the harm concept. And I think if you follow right after in Exodus 20, if you follow over to Exodus 21, I'm pretty sure you'll find a similar sort of concepts where, okay, your cow hit this guy's cow, your dog did this to this guy's kitty cat or whatever. There's then, that's harm. there's compensation that needs to be given for it. So these are the things that should typically be covered by the state. They shouldn't be covered at all whatsoever by the federal government, except for where the privileges and immunities, the state is failing to protect the privileges and immunities, if you ask me. And I'd love to hear comments, by the way, on this. And then you have, once again, we talked about the harmful loss of religious values and traditions, right? We recently heard President Oaks talk in General Conference about the old traditions of farming, camping, gardening, family, economy, right? So let's talk about, say, for example, there are communities where they'll allow you to have a garden, but only if you use a certain kind of fencing. There's no harm done to the community, yet they don't want you doing it. There are communities where they allow you to have dogs, but they won't allow you to have maybe some small goats, Nigerian dwarfs or whatever, right? What's the difference? One's a farm animal, one isn't. Is the one more deadly than the other? No, as a matter of fact, I'd argue the dog is more deadly than the goat, by like a lot. Anybody who's been around goats. So I would say the actual harm is being done by those who are creating those policies. They are harming society in general and taking away that which was virtuous, lovely, good, important, praiseworthy, that which provides life. They are preventing it and punishing it, and in order to keep that which is a predator instead, and they prioritize allowing the predator to be allowed in the community, but not the producer of food. So now there is a point, of course, where too many livestock brings flies and other issues like that can create potential diseases. However, too many dogs can cause the exact same effect. So quantity per acre is one thing, but an absolute prohibition in preference for the predatory class of animal versus the production class of animal is clearly harm actually on the part of the local government at that point, as opposed to harm on the part of the people who own the goats. Samuel Adams would have said that where a law violates the laws of nature and of nature's God, and so far everything we've been talking about is the laws of nature and of nature's God, even if you agreed to it, even if you signed a contract to it, the moment you realize that God's laws have been violated, that the laws of nature have been violated, and even somebody proposing that unconscionable contract, that contract is null and void. If you look up his rights of the colonists, and I think this is one of the most common sense things you can say. So here we are on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Samuel Adams being, I think, called the father of the revolution, something like that. He's the one that Thomas Jefferson wrote to right after he was elected president. He's like, I hope I can live up to the legacy that guys like you set up for us. I would highly recommend it. These were the best of men. They were the ones who were allowed to show up to Wilford Woodruff in St. George Temple and say, hey, we need our work done. We did our job. They led to the creation of the law that's to go forth from Zion. It was them. And we need to study what they taught us. And to say that no laws are valid whatsoever is just silly. I think they call that sovereign citizens and stuff like that. I am so not on board with that at all. But to say that it's okay to just create arbitrary laws, punishing things that do no harm at all, I'm totally not on board with that either. So, again, most things that cause harm should be dealt with by the state level. The federal government level, if you look at it, mostly what it's doing is protection from invasion, protection from this, keeping, there's just a standard equal weights and measures, for example, things that help to maintain the peace by defining things, right? Having a solid currency, the what do you call it? Intellectual rights, property rights, all those kind of things. This is not a, it was a confederation of nation states is really what was formed, but a solid one, a more perfect union. It's which puts you, like James Madison called it, a compound republic. Puts you somewhere between having a country that's one big country versus having 13 small countries and now 50, right? And that's an appropriate relationship. And then leaving, when you understand the way the founders understood things, the founders should have been, the family should have been left as the fundamental unit of society, which means creating laws that punish production of home production where no harm is done is a violation of principles that are doctrinal to us. And so, again, I would look at what the false witness actually means and what covet actually means. Look at the importance of morality and religion, and that is appropriate that the First Amendment left out the states, but actually allowed the states to say, hey, we're a Catholic state, hey, we're this, hey, we're that, right? Whereas all the others were prohibitions on all levels of government. And John Marshall, just because he was the Chief Justice doesn't mean he got it right. There were so many dissenters on his same level, pretty much. He got it wrong. Barron v. Baltimore, he got that very wrong. The amendments 2 through 9 were to apply to the states too. They were part of the privileges and immunities. So, and that's what I got. A little bit of natural law on this 250-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Sorry for the moaning of my goat right now. Have a nice day.